It was late. The garden was quiet, heavy with the stillness of night. The olive trees stood in the darkness, and the air felt thick with sorrow. Jesus had just finished praying, pouring out his heart before the Father. The weight on him was so intense, so deep, that Scripture tells us his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Nearby, his disciples had fallen asleep. Again, Peter, James, and John had wanted to stay awake for him. But sorrow and exhaustion overcame them. And there Jesus stood, carrying a burden no one else could fully understand. The loneliness of that moment is hard to put into words. Then the silence broke. Torches appeared in the distance. Voices grew louder. Footsteps pressed against the earth. A crowd was coming into the garden, armed with swords and clubs. And at the front of them was Judas. Judas walked up to Jesus, spoke words that sounded respectful, and kissed him. A sign of affection became a sign of betrayal. Everything happened fast after that. The men moved in to seize Jesus, and the disciples woke into panic. Fear surged through them. Confusion took over. Peter, acting on instinct, grabbed his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. For a moment it must have looked like everything was falling apart. But Jesus did not respond the way people expected. He did not tell his followers to fight. He did not call for escape. He did not answer violence with greater violence. Instead, he said, "Put your sword back in its place." And then, in mercy, he healed the man's ear. That alone is astonishing. In the middle of betrayal, in the middle of arrest, in the middle of the mob closing in around him, Jesus stopped to heal someone connected to the very people who came to take him away. Then he said something that pulls back the curtain and reveals just how much power was truly present in that moment. He said, "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" That was not weakness speaking. That was not helplessness. That was authority under control. Jesus made it clear that night that he was not being dragged into something against his will. He was not trapped. He was not cornered. He was not powerless before the crowd, or Judas, or the soldiers, or the religious leaders. At any moment, he could have appealed to the Father. At any moment, heaven could have answered. At any moment, the arrest could have ended before it truly began. But he did not call. And that is where the glory of this moment really shines, because the deepest power of Christ in Gethsemane was not seen in judgment unleashed. It was seen in restraint. It was seen in surrender. It was seen in obedience. Jesus went on to say, "But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled, that it must be so?" That is the answer. He did not refuse deliverance because he lacked power. He refused it because he was yielding himself fully to the will of the Father and to the plan written in the Scriptures. This was the road to the cross. This was the path the prophets had spoken of. The shepherd would be struck. The servant would suffer. The lamb would be led to the slaughter. The one without sin would bear the sins of many. Jesus knew exactly what was ahead of him. He knew about the false accusations. He knew about the mocking. He knew about the beating, the spitting, the thorns, the nails, and the cross. He knew, and still, he stayed. That is what makes this moment so holy. He was not overpowered by men. He gave himself over willingly. He was not a victim of events spinning out of control. He was the obedient son walking straight into suffering with his eyes open because love held him there. Peter reached for a sword. Jesus reached for obedience. Peter tried to stop the suffering. Jesus accepted it. Peter saw danger and wanted to fight. Jesus saw the cup the Father had given him, and he chose to drink it. That choice was not weakness. It was love in its purest form. He stayed so prophecy would be fulfilled. He stayed so sin could be paid for. He stayed so mercy could reach people like us. He stayed because without the cross, there would be no redemption. And that is what makes the scene in Gethsemane so overwhelming. The question is not whether Jesus had enough power to escape. He did. The question is why he did not. And the answer is love for the Father. love for the will of God, love for a broken world, love for sinners who could never save themselves. In the flicker of torchlight, surrounded by betrayal, fear, and violence, Jesus chose the path that would lead to our salvation. He let them bind his hands so our chains could be broken. He walked into their darkness so we could be brought into his light. He refused to call the angels so he could go to the cross. And because he stayed, we have hope. Because he surrendered, we have peace. Because he chose obedience in that garden, we can receive life through his death and resurrection. This is not just the story of power restrained. It is the story of love that would not turn back.